Hoax by NuekerFilms Part 3. Is this supposed to be funny? I said. What's with all the weird symbols? I don't know, it's just the first thing I thought it'd carve when I wrote that message from Maggie. I think it adds a little bit of a personal touch. It's creepy, right? I'm asking you why there's so many of them. Did you do all of these? Hell no. Isaac shrugged to himself, almost flattered. I don't even think any of these stories are real. They all popped up in the last couple of days, after what happened to Maggie went viral. People around town probably just want the same attention. Why are you so happy about all of this? I glared at Isaac, his behavior almost alien at that moment. Do you realize that we are responsible for the most interesting thing to happen to Arab, Alabama, in over a decade? We are internet famous. How is that not awesome? Getting thrown in jail is not awesome. Like the police are gonna be able to trace all of this back to us. It's physically impossible. I hoped what Isaac claimed was true. I believed him when he said he wasn't responsible for those other attacks, but his testimony alone couldn't rule him or the rest of us out as possible culprits. I completed the school day and transitioned into rehearsal while maintaining a constant feeling of apprehension in my chest. The reality of what I had done finally sank in once I saw the immediate repercussions. The town was afraid. Something thriving in the darkness was threatening their families and nobody knew what to do except panic. Once word of our mischief had gotten into the hands of others, there was nothing I could do to stop it from spreading except wait for either everyone to lose interest or have a more substantial event come around. It was then that I caught a glimpse of Maggie on stage, wallowing in a pool of anxiety, on edge knowing that her near attacker was still out on the loose. Her snobbish yet always amiable attitude had been drowned out and only a hollow carcass of her former self remained. She was dressed from head to toe in gray sweats, as if to reflect her inner state of mind. On one hand, I thought that Maggie was overreacting to the entire ordeal, but I was also able to understand how exactly she might be feeling, having discovered a mysterious death threat in her backyard made out just for her. She honestly didn't deserve what she had been dealt, but there was no way I could assuage the situation at this point, or else be publicly reprimanded for the entire ordeal. I needed to make amends soon, but that would soon prove more difficult than I had initially hoped. I spotted Caroline from across the auditorium as she was heading backstage, and ran in her direction. I needed to talk to someone sensible about what was going on. I grabbed her by the shoulder as she was walking through the stage door, catching her by surprise. Caroline, did you see the newspaper? I spoke anxiously, but gently as to not provoke a lecture. She humored my question, but almost immediately returned to her current objective, speaking over her shoulder. Oh yeah. I am sure everyone in town's heard about this little game by now. That's the thing. I didn't dash. What are you expecting? A reward? She scoffed. I am serious. This is getting out of hand really quickly. I hushed her, fearing someone passing by might hear us. That's what happens in a small town. News spreads, so deal with it. I felt undeserving of as much blame as she was dealing me. This was Isaac's fault. He left that weird message at Maggie's, and now everyone's talking about some psychopath that's running around town at night leaving threats on their doorsteps. Maybe you should have thought of what could happen before you ransacked one of your friends' homes. I didn't consider Maggie as a friend in even the loosest sense of the word, but I continued. I didn't think Maggie would react by calling the cops. I didn't think we'd even go that far. Caroline cut me off before I could embarrass myself any further, and placed her hand on my shoulder. Relax, dork. If you're worried about any of us ratting you out, don't be. We'd be just as viable for all of us as you. Caroline stepped back for a moment, and recomposed herself in a much more sympathetic way. Look, if you guys just lay low and stop talking about this, people aren't going to suspect a thing. That's kind of what I'm worried about. Ellipsis. I looked away from Caroline, dreading this wasn't going to be the end of it all. For a moment, I felt crazy for even suspecting my friend of any wrongdoing. But I could tell that behind Caroline's stoic reassured gaze, she shared the same fear that I had unleashed a fever inside of Isaac which, despite any efforts, I may not be able to extinguish easily. Thankfully, the initial story didn't gain as much traction as Isaac would have hoped, although that wasn't for his lack of trying. He would ride his adrenaline high until it completely spluttered out if he could. His growing obsession became the most apparent while in smaller circles, where he knew he could get away with openly bragging about his masterpiece and any news updates he found. Over the next week, I stepped back as talk of this pentagram-sporting parasite started to infect every outlet of Isaac's life, to the point where I couldn't get through a single conversation without him filling in me and anyone else who was around to listen about the latest activity. He had always been known to fixate on the most bizarre things, but this absolutely took the cake. However, it wasn't until the next school week had started that I noticed that our little urban legend was evolving into something much more sinister. With the worsening load of homework issued to us as we neared midterms, discussions of what happened at Maggie's lost their relevance. The 7 of us had agreed to look the other way and forget what had happened, so long as it was never brought up again. I had just received a 10-page study packet for my human development class, an egregious overcompensation considering the material that would fill up my schedule for the next few days if I was to complete it before the deadline. However, I found my determined attitude to be rather less so once I actually settled down that afternoon, ready to begin my intensive study session. The volatile Alabama weather had cast a pleasant and breezy blue afternoon into the shadow of a gray, thick, condescending mass of clouds. The subsequent patter of heavy raindrops on my roof resonated throughout my room, filling my brain with a steady hum akin to a mother's lullaby. My mind began to fall under the rain spell, and I was soon mesmerized by its silent song, and I slowly started to drift ellipsis. Scratch. It sounded as if a metal claw was scraping against the side of my house. I catapulted up in an instant, ripped out of my slumber, and raced over to the window to confront the source. However, when I looked down, I saw my backyard desolate as ever. The chain-link fence that encircled the overgrown patch of grass was slightly bent in on the right side, as if something heavy had pushed it down, but again there was no further evidence of any sort of intruder. Neither the puddle of mud directly below me nor the grass around it bore any footprints, so maybe the sound was forged in the deep tunnels of my subconscious while I slept. Not all the evidence could stack up in favor of either explanation, and so I sided with the latter in an attempt to reassure myself. I knew I was still on edge from the other night, and I was merely still susceptible to paranoia. I needed to put my worries to rest, however, and so I went downstairs to examine the backyard. Unfortunately, once I got out there, what I found only heightened my paranoia. Laying just outside of my range of vision from the upstairs window was a small square sandbox where I had spent countless afternoons as a child, where in the center was engraved a crude pentagram. The drizzle of rain continued to fall, and I watched as the mark was slowly washed away, camouflaging itself with the rest of the muddied sand. I could only assume that whoever the artist was, they must have left this just for me, making sure I would come out and see their drawing before it was washed away. Who would do that? My mind immediately jumped to my former accomplices, Grant, Cameron, and Isaac, as they would be the only ones who would directly target me with a prank like this. It was too much of a coincidence, and nobody in their right mind would seriously try something like this in the middle of the day. Knowing their hubris, whoever the culprit was would fess up to the joke, too proud of the finished product to not take credit. I woke the next morning, anxiously waiting to test my theory. I slipped past my parents enjoying a quiet breakfast without even so much as a mention of what I uncovered the afternoon before. As I pulled up to the school, I was met with an overwhelming wall of apprehension, not knowing how I should go about all of this. It still didn't all line up in my head. Whatever transpired in my backyard seemed unmotivated. Grant, Cameron, or Zach would have done it for the same reason a dog might sniff its own ass, yes. But surely they were at least still marginally on edge the same as me, and would have the slightest inkling of decency to not evoke more paranoia. Then again, I might have been giving 3 16-year-old boys with too much time on their hands and nothing better to do a little too much credit. I slowed my fervent pace as I entered the building. Amongst the bustling hordes of students crisscrossing to their lockers or classrooms, three boisterous and distinct voices penetrated the hum, and I steered my focus in that direction. As I made my way through the crowd, the voices took on the more obvious inflection, one of malice, of heightened anger. What did I tell you? I thought I said to leave me out of this. I did. But then one of you guys thought it'd be funny to do it to me. It wasn't me. I swear to God. Well, somebody's lying. I pushed my way into a clearing near a patch of lockers to find Caroline, Grant, and Cameron standing in a circle, all pointing fingers at each other. I approached cautiously, as if I were stepping into a tiger's cage. Whoa, what's going on? I said, more afraid than I had intended. Their fiery feud continued without interruption. Stop trying to be funny. Cameron leered at Caroline. Does it look like I'm laughing? Caroline reeled back. You scared the shit out of me. Guys. The three of them instantly turned their attention towards me. What the hell is going on? Cameron stepped forward to speak, but his words still seemed targeted at the others. What's going on? Cameron started in a tone as if I should already know what their argument was about. What's going on is one of these shoals carved a pentagram into the glass on my bedroom window. How am I supposed to explain that to anyone? My body turned rigid at the mention of that symbol. I continued to listen, transfixed. It wasn't me. Caroline stepped up. Someone literally tore up my entire backyard and carved that stupid thing in the dirt. And only one of you guys would be so stupid to try something that big. Oh, because we were just such bad people to you, now? Grant closed the discussion up to just the three of them again. Why would I do that to Cameron? Or why would he do that to me? How can I know both of you are telling the truth and aren't just trying to screw with me? Caroline snarked. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I found only the slightest comfort knowing they had all experienced the same thing and that I wasn't alone in this, but honestly this revelation brought on a much larger wave of pure dread. Wait, so you guys all found that pentagram somewhere at your houses? I asked cautiously, not ready to rope myself into this. Well, they say so, but I know one of you is lying. Just admit it. Caroline was both right and wrong. There was no way all of us could still be a coincidence, but I highly doubted either of the guys would lie about something like this unless ellipsis I remembered Isaac and the fever I saw in his eyes as he stared at the paper. Could he have been the one responsible for this? What was being described came off was much more severe than just a dumb prank. I didn't think he would do something like that ellipsis, but I felt that night at Maggie's had made Isaac even more impulsive, unpredictable. That was me ellipsis, I suddenly choked out. That was all me. I am sorry. I got a bit carried away. Even as the dots started to connect, I wasn't about to start a witch hunt based solely on speculation. I needed hard evidence, but I needed to put this to rest, and that meant putting a definite face to these attacks. I thought it would be funny, but I guess it didn't work out. Clearly not, Caroline blurted out. What the hell made you want to do that? I stammered, looking for a logical explanation. I don't know ellipsis, I just ellipsis, I promise I'll pay to get everything fixed. Good. Caroline crossed her arms, content to not hear anything else. Thanks, man, Cameron said, somewhat reluctantly. Sorry I got kinda pissed, thanks. Gramps' reassuring words didn't distract from the idea brewing in my mind that Isaac, or whoever did this, had some deeper motive. Starting that morning, I watched Isaac. I observed his mannerisms, what he said, what he didn't say. Class to class, he seemed just as carefree and wild as ever, nothing to hint at any hidden agenda. However, at lunch, he seemed a bit more off-putting. As the rest of our circle was attempting to return to normalcy, Isaac remained quiet and reserved. The details of that conversation evade me now, as all I can recall is his shifting glances side to side as we coordinated a movie night for that night after our rehearsal. He jumped slightly at the sound of his name when asked a question. Instead of hopping on board the discussion, Isaac blatantly dismissed the idea entirely, preferring to stay at home that night and get some rest. Isaac had devolved from a sporadic and engaging guy to something utterly unrecognizable. Because of this, I knew I was never going to get any solid confirmation from him directly, even though his behavior heavily suggested he was in fact up to something. I would thus have to defect to more extreme measures, like Isaac, to get any sort of resolution. I ducked out too. Accompanying the ball of flailing heat and fire in the sky as it grazed the horizon that night was a hush, a veil of silence that painted the streets vacant, and the entire town mute. Arab was a small community where its inhabitants tended to keep to themselves more often than not, but the events of the past week had added the byproduct of paranoia to the town's unusual level of silence. Every step I took towards my car in the shadow of night seemed to compound in the eerie quiet, echoing across my neighborhood. This gave me no comfort as I navigated my way towards Isaac's house in Pine Lake, a tiny residential community on the north border of the town, carved out of 60 acres of pine forest. As I passed the entrance, I was enveloped by the thick forest of lumbering trees swaying in the wind. They arched over the road in some places, fully encasing me in the dome of foliage. After another few minutes of driving, I rounded a sharp bend, and Isaac's house emerged at the top of a small hill in front of me. His car was still parked at the edge of the driveway, and the light in his corner bedroom still shined through the window, making me question my actions. I parked my car at the bottom of the hill, off of the left shoulder, and proceeded to wait. I felt seedy and slimy stooping to this level, but my drive for answers overpowered my courtesy towards his privacy. Although his alibi checked out, the conveniences of the past week had led me to question everything. After another half hour of intently watching Isaac from a few hundred feet away, I was interrupted by an oncoming pair of headlights racing down the hill. I tensed up, looking for a way to hide, but knew there was nothing I could do to get out of the way. Before I could fully react, the headlights swerved around the side of me and continued to zoom on past me, honking the entire way. However, just as the taillights were about to turn the corner, they stopped and began to back up in my direction. At that moment, the level of my stupidity finally hit me, as I was either about to be reprimanded for my actions, or more simply draw too much attention to myself and risk blowing the operation entirely. The vehicle slowed to a halt as its front window reached mine, although it towered over me. Just as I was about to give up hope, I caught the shape of the vehicle from the reflection of its lights, a familiar beat-up red Ford F-150. Noah. The truck's window rolled down and I could see Elizabeth sitting in the driver's seat. Hey. Yeah, it's me ellipsis, I said bashfully. I hadn't seen her outside of school since the night at her house, and so this was understandably uncomfortable in its own, let alone under these specific circumstances. What are you doing just parked here? Her cheeks were pale and rosy, most likely a combination of October's light and blushing from having to endure this awkward interaction. I am picking up Isaac. We were going out ellipsis. What are you doing over here? Elizabeth looked up the road, gesturing towards a house around the bend. I'm going to Riley Grace's. Tonight's movie night ellipsis. Oh ellipsis that ellipsis forgot that was tonight ellipsis. At that moment, I realized that, in her eyes, I was blatantly ignoring them, which caused me to stumble over, which clearly wasn't going to help me in any way. Yeah ellipsis. Elizabeth simply smiled and looked down. Unwavering, refusing to look me in the eye, she spoke again. What do you mean by going out? I stared at her blankly, unsure of the proper response. Oh, ellipsis. We're just going to ellipsis at ellipsis. Elizabeth cut me off before I could mutter another incomprehensible string of syllables. Are you guys doing that again? I immediately understood what she was referencing. What? No ellipsis, like I said, it was a one-time thing. Elizabeth looked up at me, slightly disheartened. I'm a little worried, Noah.